Hi, we continue in Luke 18 today in verses 9 to 14, which follow directly from the story of the widow and the judge, and as Luke framed it around the need to pray constantly, especially for those who are feeling pressed upon, or those who feel with the journey to Jerusalem coming to an end and within the story, or those outside the story facing the destruction of Jerusalem or the aftermath of it, that God would actually listen to people like them rather than to the elite and the wealthy and the others that they've been told at least are those who are closer to God. So this story, a little parable about those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt, as you can see on the left side of the screen in verse 9, follows directly from that. And as you can see on the right side of the screen, we've been continuing to follow this last unit of the journey to Jerusalem here as we began in 1711 through 1948. And the last story and this one are both around the frame of prayer. And as we saw, the last one was paired with the story of the visitor at midnight, showing, along with the immediate story of the judge, two examples of what God is not like, and so that people should not be afraid to ask God for the things they need, whether that's food or justice, because God is not like a reluctant neighbor, and God is not like a mean Roman judge. Today, around the question of what prayer looks like, although the theme is trusting in yourself and self-justification, but the content of the actual parable are two different forms of actually praying. And that brings us back in parallel to the Jesus teaching the Lord's Prayer back in 11:1 to 4. So if we were to compare those side by side, we'd see three different versions of prayer: what Jesus teaches, what the Pharisee does in the parable, and what the tax collector does. But I'm going to show us even deeper intratextual connections in these 6 verses with the rest of Luke's gospel that ought to allow us to read it from those without any other support. But we'll get to that in just a second. So as we've been looking at the shape of this entire unit, as I was noting at the beginning of the unit, if you haven't watched the introduction, I really encourage you to do so. But the introduction points out that this first scene of the 10 lepers healed and only one of them coming to give thanks to God for what Jesus has done and seeing himself as not only clean but healed is the paradigmatic story for the entire unit, where the rejection is the key. And here the issue is going to be around those who don't think they need Jesus or God, at least beyond the way it's portrayed in this scene, because they're good as they are, at least see themselves as good as they are. So that'll be another element of it. As we've been looking at this, I really want to highlight again some of the faulty presuppositions, because although there aren't that many directly faulty presuppositions about this passage as there were about the others we've seen, this passage itself can be misread if one misreads the previous stories, and we'll see at least one example of that, where this is misread by being taken out of its narrative context and read on its own. So my first note up here, they should be read in parallel with their chiastic partners, and that had to do with the Lord's Prayer, but also, as all of it, with the narrative context and the sequence they find it, and that has to do with here around this theme of rejection. Because if we don't hear that, as we'll see as one commentator does, that this story is about a Reformation issue of faith versus works, with the Pharisees as stand-in for the Jews, which is not only violates the narrative context, but is blatantly anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic as well. So since we see after the narrator's introduction and Jesus begins the parable, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, we can look at a couple of things here. Prayer in Luke's gospel, and as I've noted all along, prayer is much more in Luke than elsewhere. We see that proseuchomai, the basic Lucan word for pray, is 19 times in Luke, of 44 times in all the Gospels. And we saw it just in our last passage, 18:1, about the need to pray, and now we see it in our immediate scene here. So certainly prayer is fitting here in light of all the rejection and apocalyptic imagery that we saw in the last scene, and that we'll see when we get to chapter 21 outside the travel narrative as well as the immediate rejection that Jesus gets from the various members of the Jerusalem elite after he arrives. So we'll see that as well. And we also know that among the 2 men who went up to pray, one is a Pharisee and the other is a tax collector. As far as we know, the Pharisees are actually out there with him. We saw in 17:20 that was a Pharisee who asked Jesus when the kingdom of God would come. And we've been noting they've been there throughout the entire entire travel narrative, although we don't hear of them here, and we don't hear any response from the Pharisees saying, how dare you characterize us that way. But as we look at Pharisees in Luke's gospel, we see there only one other time at the end here, and that's where they're trying to persuade Jesus to have his disciples be silenced, and he says that even the stones would cry out. So it's important that we look back at a couple of the characterizations of Pharisees to highlight, as I've been doing, that Luke does not use them as examples of the actual historical Pharisees that he may actually not know that much about. They're not in the Septuagint, and that's his basic source for understanding the tradition out of which Jesus emerges and that he proclaims as fulfilled in his hearing, as we heard from the Isaiah passage in the Nazareth sermon back in Luke 4. But instead, we see the key was in 1614, they were described as silver lovers around the question of loving God and loving money. So in that element, I'm suggesting that they're stand-ins for Luke's Roman elite audience, especially when there's nothing about them that suggests any kind of Jewish behavior or temple-related behavior or Pharisee-related behavior for that matter. In our immediate scene here, as we'll see in verse 11 and 12, there is something that's vaguely Phariseistic, if that's a word, although as many commentators note, it's a caricature of that. No real Pharisee would be heard praying in this blatantly self-absorbed way. But he's using it as a caricature to obviously make a contrasting point, as we'll see. But the main way I want to get through our passage is showing these intratextual links. And I know this may be kind of small on your screen. I can make it bigger, but then you can't see the whole thing. And what you can see in blue are elements of our immediate scene, and in green are intratextual references. Intratextual means references within the Gospel of Luke, as opposed to intertextual, which has to do with connections between Luke and other texts, usually Hebrew scripture or non-canonical texts like 1 Enoch. And I put them up on the right, color-coding the green word that's the match, even when they don't translate directly as entrusted in themselves here, but it's translated as convinced there. And I'm just going to make that one smaller so you can see the entire quote. Maybe you can zoom it in on your own screen if you want. But I want to go through this to highlight that by the time we get to chapter 18 as we are, we've heard enough about all these issues, and you see how many different references there are, to be able to interpret our passage just based on what we see here, apart from any particular scholarly insights or even insights into the Greek from this passage. Although I will share some of those, but I want to highlight how the tool of intratextual linking here really helps us to hear what's going on. It's the exact opposite of just reading a text on its own as if it's a freestanding unit. This shows that it's deeply embedded in a narrative that Luke has constructed, so that by the time we get to this point, we've heard all those things. So let's go through my notes on the left side, and we'll also be connecting with the scene on the right. So this is at the end of the verse for emphasis to highlight, to those who trust themselves he told this parable. But note that this is the narrator speaking, and as far as anybody actually listening goes, Jesus said, when the human one comes, will he find faith on earth, faith on earth, and then just keeps talking. 2 men went up to the temple, with no introduction and no bridge, no sense of, just a minute, let me change topics. It seems like it's just continuous, other than for the narrator's intervention of explaining what's going on here, just like he explained in 18:1 the parable that followed in 18:2-5. But having that there makes a pause for us and an explanation for us, but for the audience, this is just Jesus continuing. So since we heard a story about the ability to go to a God who's not like the judge and expect to be heard the cry for justice, and that God will not delay, then we turn to this story. So, and the note below is simply what I just said. So 2 men went up to the temple, and interestingly, this is the first time the temple has been mentioned at all since the devil took Jesus up on the mount of the temple and invited him to throw himself off and trust that God would protect him. We've seen Jerusalem mentioned a couple of times. Of course, the journey is focused on going to Jerusalem and ending in Jerusalem, and we saw Jesus lament over in Jerusalem at the center. But the temple itself has not been mentioned. So Jerusalem has been the site of the imperial coalition between the Sanhedrin and Rome, but the temple as both a building and as an institution have not been focused on. But it will be in 1945 and 47, as you can see on the right side of the screen. And I've gone past a couple of the points here, so let's go back to those as we go. So those who trusted in themselves, that's the key here, and we'll see it'll be described as justified in themselves, that they were righteous. And we saw back in 15:7, after one of the two lost parables there, first about the sheep and then about the coin, how much more joy there is in heaven over one sinner who repents and over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance, or at least believe in their hearts that they need no repentance. So the situation, one sinner versus a righteous person, is exactly what we have in our situation, where the Pharisee will characterize himself as not like other people, and the tax collector will explicitly describe himself as a sinner. The regarding others with contempt anticipates Herod and his soldiers treating Jesus with contempt and mocking him. So we see the pattern there. So just as Herod and his soldiers treat Jesus with contempt, which is to say, mock him for not going along with their view of things, so those who see themselves as self-righteous see others who imagine they need God or see themselves as so weak, they see those with contempt. And so as the story goes, two men went to the temple to pray. It doesn't say for a feast. It doesn't say whether this would be for Passover or Sukkoth or Pentecost. One of the three main feasts in Deuteronomy 16 they're supposed to go up to the temple for. There's no particular reason that people who weren't in Jerusalem would go to Jerusalem to pray other than for one of those feasts, and that context makes sense of what Jesus concludes in the parable about the tax collector going down to his home, going down from Jerusalem and returning home after this. So one a Pharisee, and then we don't know anything else about them, but this certainly recalls when they were described as silver lovers, and a tax collector. And of course, as a tax collector, it not only echoes 15:1 that the Pharisees, tax collectors and sinners were coming to him. In this case, the tax collector is a sinner, so he falls in both categories, as will Zacchaeus in chapter 19, as we'll see very soon. But it was the Pharisees and the scribes grumbling at that point that he's welcoming sinners. So not only we've seen a Pharisee and a tax collector in the same scene before, but we already know how the Pharisees feel about Jesus gathering with the tax collectors. So the Pharisee, we're told here, standing by himself. And as Green notes, the Pharisee's prayer begins like a thanksgiving psalm, but never enumerates the divine actions for which one is thankful. Excuse me. As Vincent notes, the prayer contrasts sharply with those in Luke 1 by Mary and Zechariah, and there's no doubt of that case there. And Doran adds, as I was noting, the Pharisee's prayer is a caricature. The fact that he's standing by himself, parallel here to the rich fool whose land produces and he thinks it's about him, and so he thought to himself. And there's a wonderful irony of the Pharisee standing by himself, because the very name Pharisee means separatists. People who were separating themselves from those who they saw as sinners in order to be the pure remnant that would bring about the Messiah. It wasn't so much that they saw themselves as above those people and therefore that they couldn't be associated with them. It's that they thought they were doing a service to the people of God by being separate, so they could be pure and represent a purified Israel and their remnant. But here, that's not exactly his mode. He's not doing this for others. He's doing it for himself. So standing by himself was praying thus, God, I thank you. And the thanking here recalls the leper just in the previous chapter, the only time Eucharistio had been used otherwise in Luke. So whereas the leper thanks Jesus for healing him, this person thanks God for making him as he is, not like other people. And notice he starts off by the first thing he's thankful for is, I'm not like other people, and then he names the ways he's not like other people, at least in his own mind. Of course, he knows nothing about whether the practices of all these other people fast or tithe or anything else, but he's making a stereotypical assumption, just as we can easily see in our world, whether that's about the so-called faithful who go to church and look down on others, or people with any ideological view who think people who disagree with them are somehow less and are thankful for being who they are, or at least who they imagine they are, and not like others. And here are the examples he gives. First, not like others, the loipoi, as in verse 9. Here are the others. Thieves, which is only here, harpax, but the others are not. Rogues is a bad translation of dikios, the unjust or the lawbreaker. So we saw here back in 16:10:11, whoever is unjust in a very little is unjust in very much. So he's right in seeing himself not like the unjust. But if we recall in the parables around 16, Jesus was trying to get people to learn from that, the unjust manager, how to create a jubilee with the mammon of injustice. So we can recall that story. Like, he's not an adulterer, a moikoi, only here in Luke Acts, but in verse 20 below, when the commandments are named, again, just 9 verses later, Jesus tells the rich man, you know the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, is where he starts. So there's no allegation the rich man has committed adultery, but this is put in the air here. And whether that's meant to be about literal adultery or figurative adultery, like we see in Revelation, when adultery means intercourse with empire, isn't made clear here. Or even like this tax collector, which highlights that he sees him. Even though he's standing by himself, he sees this tax collector and compares himself. And notice the contrast with the Pharisee standing by himself and the tax collector is very similar to Lazarus and the rich man at his gate, although the rich man never sees Lazarus, and so it's not a verbal direct parallel as we can see here. He continues as he describes, telling God what God presumably already knows. I fast twice a week. And the fasting recalls what we see here when precisely the question is, John's disciples, like the disciples of the Pharisees, frequently fast and pray, but your disciples eat and drink. And Jesus' response is, the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. So the fact that the Pharisee in the parable is described as fasting twice a week regardless is highlighting he doesn't recognize the kairos. He doesn't recognize the moment that this is for. And even though it's a parable, it certainly suggests that even in a story that he should recognize that Jesus is here and it's a moment for celebration, not for fasting. He fasts twice a week. As Fitzmyer notes, there's no earlier attestation, that's wrong below, of twice weekly Jewish fasting. It's to highlight that it's like somebody a Christian who says, I go to church twice a day, or even twice a week for anybody who's not a Catholic going to daily Mass perhaps, that I'm even more pious than I need to be. I'm even more obedient than I need to be. Not that more is necessarily better. Would fasting 7 times a week be better and never eating at all? Don't think that's God's intention, is it? He says, I give 1/10 of all my income, which is, the tithe. And then we see similarly down here, back in 1142, woe to you Pharisees, you tithe herbs and things, but neglect justice and the love of God. And so notice it says he gives 1/10 of his income, but it doesn't say why or who to. So the tithing on mint would mean giving some of the mint, but neglecting justice would say tithing justice, which would say doing some of your work for justice. Who is he giving this 1/10 to? It doesn't say. And the phrase apodikato could mean a tithe on all. It could mean everything I'm acquiring. And so it could mean that he's doing it faithfully in a way that even Jesus would suggest. But again, it doesn't say where it's going. It simply says on all that I'm acquiring. Income is over-determining that it's on his money here. It's on everything that he's acquiring. He says he gives 1/10. And he's perfectly happy in himself in that. And of course, in the story, there's no response from God saying, yay, good for you, self-righteous Pharisee. And then in contrast, the tax collector. And as Vincent notes from the other perspective, from the perspective of the Pharisee, seeing the tax collector as, he's a leech, he's a traitor, he ought to burn in hell for what he has done to the poor, and he's got a lot of nerve coming up here to the temple to pray. Doran notes the parallel with the rabbinic prayer for Yom Kippur, as in the Midrash, Leviticus Rabbah, confessing and seeking forgiveness and pardon, much like this tax collector. So the tax collector, standing far off by himself, not seeing himself as worthy to be standing near people. And the Pharisee, notice, standing by himself as opposed to standing far off here. Would not even look up to the sky or literally lift up his eyes. And again, as always in Luke, the word for heaven here, aranos, simply means the sky. It doesn't mean some place that souls go in the afterlife. But was beating his breast, anticipating the crowds after the crucifixion returning home, beating their breasts in 23:48, as you can see here on the right side of the screen, saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. You notice he's actually asking for something. The Pharisee's not asking for anything. He's simply offering a thanksgiving, and that's good enough. But the tax collector recognizes he's in need, and what he's in need of is mercy, although it's not the usual word for mercy, eliao, that we've seen elsewhere in other places. It's an unusual word, hilasthetai, in this context, have pity. And the irony is sometimes translations like the NRSV say have pity when what it really means is compassion. But here it says be merciful when what it really is have pity. And we see some of these other uses from the Septuagint translated as pardon or as forgive in different places. So a little different than merciful. And this is his full self-description. I'm a sinner. He sees himself completely that way. Whether Zacchaeus sees himself that way, we'll have to wait and see, because he never describes himself that way. But he's a rich tax collector who's going to give back, and so we'll see that there. And so, again, the sinner recalls 15:1, but that was not a separate one. I didn't put that down there. And so in 18:14b, it's an exact parallel of 14:11. Before we get there, let's finish. I tell you, this man, although literally this one, it's not this man. And notice how Jesus says this as if it's somebody there. It's in story form here, almost parallel to the widow in chapter 21, who they actually see putting coins into the treasury. It's not a parable there, but Jesus remarks on her in a very parallel way to how he remarks here. And although that's not within the travel nerve, it's not a direct intratextual reference, it certainly seems connected, especially since the previous story to our immediate story was about a widow, and that one will be in the temple and involve the relationship of the temple to the poor. So many other references beyond the ones I'm linking on the right side of the screen. So this one went down to his home. And it's an interesting detail that's not necessary for the story. They're found in the temple. It doesn't say anything about how they got there or why they're there, but it's suggesting he's going home after whatever feast this was, justified. And notice he doesn't hear a word of response. He doesn't have a priest come up to him, and God doesn't come out of the sky, and this is not like the Transfiguration where he says, "You're my beloved son." It's simply the prayer of beating his breast and calling on God to be merciful that makes him justified. And as my note below has, it redirects the yearning for divine vengeance on others to mercy for oneself. And that is key. So although the Pharisee did not call for vengeance on others, he certainly saw himself as above others and would certainly not be asking anything good on people he names as thieves or the unjust or adulterers or tax collectors. And notice the either or of the comparison. He went home justified rather than the other. The Greek phrase here, par ekionon, has been argued about text critically whether it should be this other phrase, hegar ekinos, instead, as a comparative would suggest, quote, certainly not the other, unquote. And Doran, whose piece I've been citing several times so far, notes the possibility of a non-either-or comparison, but as he says, and I think this is important, as far as I can see, the only factor in the context that has led interpreters to choose an exclusive meaning is a disinclination to say that a Pharisee is upright or justified. Which highlights what happens when you assume you already know the answer before you get there. But it could be either way. It could be that this one could be either one, although plainly in the story the self-righteous is not the right one. So Doran rejects the amended version, which is substituting the other phrase, and he concludes that this is an agonistic story revealing a struggle between two opposing views, following Roman tradition, and noting precisely the story of the woman in the temple that we'll see in chapter 21. So rather than the other, or that one, so this one rather than that one, for all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and we've seen these words before, especially in 14:11, when the exact same phrase is used. And so it ends here with an exact quote, certainly drawing us back to 14:11. And we'll certainly see in the next scene when we get to the story of the rich man that we're also drawn back here to the previous version of another repeated line. So with it ending on the humble will be exalted, we see, just like the previous story, the frame interprets the parable. The frame about those who are self-righteous or justify themselves or be humble is around a story about how to pray, which recalls the parallel from chapter 11. So to the extent that, as I was noting last time, that the presupposition about 18:1 to 8 that Luke somehow was taking something that was really from Jesus and ruining it somehow, whereas in this story people know it's only exclusively exclusively from Luke. It's not elsewhere in the other stories. And so it's just Luke doing what Luke does, framing a parable with another theme so that each of these stories can be heard from two different perspectives. In this case, how to pray and how to be right with God. So we'll pick it up next time with the story of being humble as it continues in our chain about bringing children to Jesus, and with great irony having those in front trying to stop them. We'll see you with that next time. Bye-bye.